For the next few weeks and maybe months, actually, we're going to be talking about how we are sent people, how God is a sending kind of God. Partly, this is because I have a book coming out called Let God Send, but actually, as we looked over the Revised Common Lectionary texts, those are texts kind of set for a 3-year cycle of readings through Scripture, for Sundays, when we looked at those texts, we started to see this theme of God sending his people out, of moving people, always people on a journey. And so today we're going to focus a little bit on that. And I have to say, this is going to be so good. I loved looking at this text, and it's a really great story that we have today. I want to start, though, with there's this desire sometimes that many of us might have. There's sometimes a desire to run and hide, to run away. And this is in this story. It's actually the backstory to this story about this prophet in ancient Israel. And why does this prophet want to run away? He, in fact, runs away at least twice in his story. He wants to run away because his world is upside down. There is a drought one of the times that he runs away. No one has food. And guess what? This natural disaster that has happened and the repercussions from it, the government of this prophet's time takes no responsibility for it. And instead, what the government does, the king and the queen, is they point the finger at this prophet, Elijah, because he was actually the one to point out all the warnings of an impending national disaster. He also, and maybe this is why they pointed the finger at him, he also happened to point out to the people that the government, the king, and the queen had allied themselves with certain religious factions. And it had led to a major corruption in Israel. So the government is corrupt, there's a famine, and there are these religious fanatics who worship these two gods, Baal and Asherah. And it's the prophets of those gods that are essentially the ones calling the shots for the nation of Israel. You see, this other religion has basically become the state religion. And then you've got this Elijah, this prophet, and he is now public enemy number one. King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, you might have heard of her. You might have heard that name before. They point to this prophet and they call him the disturber of Israel. They don't call him prophet. They call him the disturber of Israel. And so the prophet had run away, and so he's away from his country and his homeland, and God eventually tells Elijah, the drought that's been going on now for 3 years is going to be over. So go back to the king and let him know that the drought is going to be done. Now, he does go, sort of. He doesn't necessarily go straight to the king. But I don't know if it was sort of like the prophet sensed, maybe the time is right for this whole craziness to stop, for things to go back from being upside down to right side up, that maybe now is the time for the nation to get back to being faithful to who they really are as a people. Because that had all gone out the window. And what the prophet does in the midst of this is he sets up a contest between himself and between 450 prophets of Baal and Asherah on the other side. And it's actually this great story. If you go and read it, it happens on Mount Carmel. They set up 2 different altars and they have a sacrifice that goes on each altar. And the prophets of Baal and Asherah are supposed to cry out to their God and say, send down fire to burn up the offering. And so they do that. And Elijah stands at a distance and mocks them and says, maybe your God's sleeping. Or maybe he's gone on a journey somewhere, so call him louder. Maybe you need to be louder. And so they just cry out louder and louder and louder. And nothing happens, of course. Like there's no fire comes down from heaven. And then Elijah steps up and it's his turn. And first thing he does is he orders that the altar be totally soaked with water, and there's a trench dug around it, and the trench has to be filled with water. And then Elijah, instead of like this loud cry and doing all this stuff, like the prophets of Baal like did all these ritual like type things, he just prays a simple prayer and asks for God to show up. And fire comes down from heaven, and it's so hot, it consumes the offering, and it's so hot that it evaporates all the water in the trench. And then Elijah orders the people of Israel to chase down the prophets of Baal and kill them. And the prophets of Baal take off, obviously, because they're worried about the fire, first of all, and then they get tracked down and they destroy the prophets. All of the people on the wrong side are now gone by the people who rally to Elijah's side. And what gets reported to the king and queen is not, you know what? It's been proved that the true prophet is Elijah and he's back, and the end of the drought is in sight, and there's been this total turnaround, and the nations can get back on track because the people who were taking it way off track have been taken down. That is not what gets reported. What gets reported is the disturber of Israel is back. And our religious leaders, he killed them. And so the prophet has to run again because he's still public enemy number one. The time was not right. He stood up to those who had taken over the nation, and it looked like it went well, but it actually didn't. Now, it might be kind of hard to relate to Elijah, but I know you might understand wanting to run for your own reasons. Not because you're an enemy of the state, but maybe because the world is just as upside down as it ever was, just as messed up as it was in Elijah's time. And we have the same kinds of questions that the prophet was raising. Who do we trust? Are the people in power corrupt? What do we do about a natural disaster or a pandemic leading to months and months or maybe years of pain for nations and for people, regular people? And then what do I do? What do you do in the midst of that? Because this is the real question before the prophet. What does it look like to be faithful? To live for God and not some false ideal that is being propagated by the powers. To live for others and not as power hungry for ourselves. What does it look like to oppose corruption and oppose injustice and also feel like you are never winning? Because that's where Elijah was. Or even, what is it going to look like when schools reopen? And how do I live faithfully? What do I do? The questions and the uncertainty and sometimes the hopelessness of it swirls around us right now. And here's the thing, the answers take time. They take time. And this is so hard for us because we're used to getting answers in a fairly controlled, measured, and reasoned kind of way. And often what we don't want to ask is, well, what might God be up to? And I don't even mean in the grand scheme of things, like globally. I even just mean in our own lives. We don't want to ask, or we simply don't ask, well, where is God at work? Where might God be sending me? And maybe it's because those answers rarely come in a flash, and we're used to answers when we want them, right? We're used to going to Google and just asking Google the question that we have and getting the answer. And now we've had many, many months of questions and partial answers, or answers that we don't really want. And it's actually more akin to the way God works sometimes. Answers rarely come in a flash when it comes to God and discernment. It's always a process, it's always a journey, but yes, God is sending and God is with us. And so the prophet's response to his next situation is to run away again. So that's what he does. He finds out the king and queen have decided they've put a mark on him. They basically said, we've got to get rid of this prophet. We're going to kill him. And so his response is to run. That seems like a pretty logical response. He runs away. But this time when he runs away, he really hits the wall. And he gets to a point where he can see no way out and he wants to die. He cries out to God. He cries out to God and says, take my life. And he says, for I am no better than my ancestors. Do you hear what he says, right? He has ambition that's been driving him. When he cries out to God and says, take my life for I'm no better than my ancestors, he's looking back and comparing himself to the big guns, right? Like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses. And he's looking back and going, I thought I was actually better. Like I thought I was really leading the people here, but I'm not. It's not working. And I don't bring up that ambition to say that that's actually a bad thing for Elijah. It actually makes this prophet who he is. But it also puts him in a place of utter despair. And so, as we continue with his story, we find out that he doesn't die, but he lays down under a broom tree, it tells us, and he fell asleep. And then we read, this is now in 1 Kings chapter 19, around verse 5 to 10. We read, suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, get up and eat. And he looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. See, I love this. The prophet is at the end of his rope. God, just take my life. All he can do is lie there and sleep. Has anyone been there? Has anyone been there where it's like, oh, I can't even get out of bed? And God's response is, have something to eat. Here you go. It's basic, right? This is what we do. Someone is in grief, someone is struggling, make them a cup of tea. Have a drink of water, bring them some food, eat something. You get a meal prepared for you, brought right to where you are sleeping. You don't have to get out of bed. It's right at your head. Here you go. And you eat and you drink and you collapse again. It's all you can do. I don't know if anyone watching has been there. But God doesn't leave the prophet there. The next sentence, the angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him and said, get up and eat. Otherwise, the journey will be too much for you. And he got up and ate and drank. You see, there's a little more now from God, right? It's the second day, and it's on the second day that the journey is presented, not the first day. This is really important, right? Get up and eat. You'll need strength for this journey you're about to go on. See, God doesn't announce the journey on the first day. We really need to hear this. On the first day, it's just eat and drink, just take care of the basic needs. Sometimes we're desperate, we're in crisis, we have anxiety, we are struggling, we can barely move, and God is not asking us to move on that day. Just eat and drink. Get your rest. But we also need to hear that God doesn't leave us there. There is a journey. It's the next day, the next step. God is taking you or sending you somewhere, but the answers aren't right there. Like, it's not like God says, eat and drink because you're going to need this for the journey, and this is the final destination, and this is why I'm sending you there, and these are the steps you're going to take, and this is how long it's going to be. None of that is there. The answers are not there. Those answers are still a long way off. Getting any answers is a much longer journey. And even then, when we might get to some of those answers, we have to know that we might not get all of the answers, and we might not get the answers we want. But we read, the prophet ate and drank, and then he went in the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. And wow, there's so much in this sentence, isn't there, right? The prophet is going on this long journey. It's a wilderness journey. He's on his own, walking in the desert, in the wilderness. Horeb, if you're familiar with Mount Sinai, you might have be more familiar with that, where the 10 Commandments were received. Horeb and Sinai are essentially equivalent. They're the same mountain. So he's going to the mountain of God, where the 10 Commandments come from, right? Where Moses met with God. That's where he's going. And he's on that journey for 40 days and 40 nights, right? So we've got to hear that wilderness story of the people of God. Horeb is Sinai. 40 days is 40 years wandering in the wilderness before the Israelites came to the promised land. This is a huge part of our journey as the people of God. The wilderness, the waiting, just putting one foot in front of the other. It takes time. And this is so significant and so hard for us. Actually, going for a walk makes a huge difference. Often attributed to Augustine, and this would be like the 4th century, is that he had responded to some Greek philosophy by saying this: it is solved by walking. I think when Augustine said it, he was talking about like get going, like start making a move. But also there's something about actually moving, about walking, that is quite helpful. I even did this when I was preparing for this sermon. I went for a walk, and when I started the walk, I didn't even know I was preparing for this sermon. And that's kind of how the journey is. This is how prayer walking works. Prayer walking, as some of you will know, is really important to me. Often when you're praying for discernment, like praying like, God, what would you like me to do? Or praying about a decision to make, or praying about a situation, I find moving is really helpful. And I can tell you right now that any clarity that comes from that kind of prayer, like any hearing from God, it never happens on the first half of the walk. And it doesn't matter how short or long the walk is. So if you're going for a 2-hour walk, it's always in the second hour. If you're going for a 15-minute walk, it's often in the last 5 minutes. Why is that? I don't know, but that's how it is for me. When I go and pray, when I'm walking, the clarity starts to emerge on the way. It's not as though I think at the beginning, well, I really need to go for a walk so that I can figure out this, and you've already kind of got it figured out. That's not how it works. It takes time. And I think it takes calming yourself a little bit. And I think that's what this next part of the story, the part that we heard, is about. We read that he finally gets to the mountain, goes up the mountain, goes into a cave, and he spends the night there. And we say we hear the word of the Lord came to him saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Which is kind of funny because I would expect Elijah to say, "Well, you're the one who sent me on this journey. Like, why are you asking me what I'm doing here? Like, you're God. You're supposed to be telling me why I'm here." But Elijah doesn't answer that way. That's how I would answer. He says, "I've been very zealous for the Lord," which just means I've been passionate. I've been active. I've been doing all that I'm supposed to do. I've been, I'm passionate about this. I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites, they have forsaken your covenant. They've thrown down your altars. They've killed all your prophets with the sword. That's not talking about the prophets of Baal that Elijah had killed. Prior to that, all the other prophets had been killed, God's prophets had been killed, and Elijah was the only one left. And that's what he's saying. I alone am left. And now they are seeking my life to take it away. So that's how he responds. And I think he responds that way initially because he's still desperate. Right? The prophet still doesn't have any clarity about what he should do now, even after a 40-day walk to God's mountain on his own with no food. All he has is his prayer time with God. And all he has for his prayer back to God is, "I'm all alone. They're still out to get me. That's why I'm on this mountain." And that's where we get this amazing story. The prophet is told the Lord is about to pass by. And so he observes, I guess, from the cave what is happening. And there's this great wind, this huge wind, rock-splitting wind. It's so windy, it's breaking the rocks off the mountain. And the word that's used here for wind is ruach, which we make a big deal about in other places in the Bible because it's the same word that's used for spirit. The Spirit of God, the wind of God, the breath of God. And this is really significant here because there's this huge wind, this huge ruach, the most powerful ruach spirit you can have. And we find out, but God is not in that wind. Then there is an earthquake that shakes the mountain. And prior to this, there have been other earthquakes in the Bible, and almost always the earthquakes have been about the people worshiping so loudly and so vibrantly that things are shaking. Or people are shaking in fear, and even the earth is shaking in fear because of God being so magnificent. But we're told, but God was not in the earthquake. And then there's this great fire that descends on the mountain. And God has shown up in fire before, and there's lots of accounts of that, particularly, say, the pillar of fire that leads the Israelites through the wilderness. But I would say most significantly in the story I just told you, about Elijah's showdown with the prophets of Baal and Asherah, where God did show up in fire, coming down and consuming the sacrifice and all of the water. But we're told that on Mount Horeb, God was not in the fire. God wasn't in any of these until finally there is a sound of sheer silence. Or what some translations will say, a still small voice. The quiet. And there is God. there is the prophet's encounter with the Holy One. Not in the large acts, the earthquake, the fire, the wind. Not in the most obvious, not in the trembling, quaking, rock-splitting wind or fire from on high. The prophet didn't meet God there that day, but in the silence. Where do we meet God? Where might God be leading or sending? Might God be doing something significant in this time? Might God be inviting us on a journey? Perhaps it's a quieter journey, a smaller one, a more personal one. And then here is where we might realize that the prophet is not actually at the end of his 40-day journey. Well, he's finished 40 days, but he's not at the end of his journey. Even in the small scale, he's at the midpoint. He went 40 days there. He has another 40 days going back. There will be more thinking, more praying on the road, but there will also be more determination, more strength, and more resolve. See, God was actually speaking to the prophet all along, and we get it. It's not that he only heard God in the silence, in the still small voice. I mean, right before the wind, God spoke to him and said, "What are you doing here? What are you doing here?" And it's funny because after this encounter, out of the silence, after he's observed, well, God's not in these big things, but this sound of sheer silence, and this is where I've encountered God today. God comes again and asks exactly the same question. What are you doing here, Elijah? And you wonder, well, what is God really asking? Because God actually sent the prophet on this journey in the first place. Why are you here on God's holy mountain? Why did you come here? What are you searching for? Or maybe even, who are you really, Elijah? The prophet answers God's question with the exact same words that he said before. So is the prophet just stubborn? No, I actually think he has nowhere left to turn but God. He's praying over and over to God these same words. God is saying, well, what are you doing here? And he continues to say, I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. You'd think when you hear the opening of the prophet's response to God that he is being bold and courageous. He's saying, I've been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, but he's not. He's despairing when he says this. Why are you here, Elijah? I've done everything I can. I've done everything I was supposed to do, God. But everything's wrecked. The world is upside down. I'm alone. And they're trying to kill me. And it's after the silence and after Elijah's admission of where he really is that then finally God gives him the mission of anointing new kings and a new prophet, and of how a renewed nation will rise out of the terrible mess that they are in. Only then does God open up a small window as to where the prophet is being sent. And so I want to encourage you today to think about where you are on this journey. Are you running away or wanting to? Are you sleeping under the broom tree? Are you at your breaking point? Are you at the beginning, not really having taken a step yet? Do you expect faster answers? And are you actually on day 1 or 2 or 3 or 40 or 80 or 120? And you're thinking, why don't I have more answers? Have you listened to God? Or have you not listened to God at all? Have you wanted things to be as obvious as fire and wind and earthquakes? Have you paid attention to God in the stillness or the quiet? Have you gone outside and taken a walk on your own? Have you already been to the mountain and now you're coming back resolved to where God is sending you? Do you have more listening to do to know your role in God's plans for your community, your workplace, your school, your church, and even your own life? Do you have more listening to do to know your role in God's plans? God is a God who sends us. This is not just about the prophet Elijah. It is about you as well. Amen.